Here we are. Now. Today, I'm going to talk to Survive the Jive, Mr. Thomas Rosell, and I wanted to ask him about the West Country where he lives, because I have been there. I have some connection there, and I love it myself, and he knows a good bit about it, and the pagan sites. I was going to ask him broadly about the paganism there and stuff, but he was telling me, he quickly elucidated the fact that there's a broad range of different, almost, I won't say competing paganisms, but the history of it was originally Celtic, and then there was Saxon paganism, and then Viking invasion. So I thought I would ask him about all these things, because of course he knows a good bit about it. So yes, Thomas, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your very aesthetic posts. I've been watching them since the days before it was called Arrest Press, and the traditional art days. It was always entertaining on the feed, and the addition of the occasional bikini babe is welcome in my view, as well as conventionally beautiful art as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I remember you back in the day on Facebook. You'd be there, and we'd have a chat about whatever, paganism or zeppelins or something.
Long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. I guess I've been doing it for a while. It started out as it starts, and then it's like a weird addiction where you have to, I better post another image. But it is a good way to grow on social media if you're trying to. I started doing it to peddle my books, like we all are doing on social media. We're trying to peddle something in a way, or like peddle our ideas at least. And it's always been effective, in my opinion, to use the old imagery, because my background's in art, so it is good, I think. And I've always followed your stuff as well. I've always been a fan, and we came close to meeting up a couple of times, so we failed at doing so. But
fate did not allow it.
But yeah, so in the West Country, by the West Country, we mean Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset. And you're a Devonshire man, a proud Devonshire man, I should add.
Well, yeah, I live in Devon, but I wasn't raised in Devon. And also, I should say that the West Country also includes Dorset, which is the county. I don't know much about Dorset, but Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset are the ones that I know more about. But yeah, in general, they're all quite similar in some respects, but also they all have their own unique histories too.
Well, okay. So what between the three of those, the major ones, and we'll call them the major ones, is there large distinction, like historically or today?
Well, there has been. I mean, the most clearly distinct historically has been Cornwall, because it did at one stage have a completely different language in it. But all of the Western Peninsula was once the kingdom of Don Monia. Don Monia was a kingdom that predates the Romans, and then that name was still in place when the Romans left, a Celtic kingdom. And it's that kingdom that is alleged that King Arthur had his seat there in what's now Tintagel in northern Cornwall. But it wasn't just Cornwall, it was Devon and parts of Somerset. Somerset is, in more recent history, Cornwall has been an impoverished sort of tin mining area, but then Plymouth, the only big cities in the West Country were Devon had two, both on the south coast. There's Exeter, which had a medieval cathedral, and Plymouth, which is basically like the starting point for the United States of America. It's where the Mayflower set off. It's where all the western direction of traffic was headed out. And Somerset, of course, has Bristol, which is a major port town as well, and it was a big slave trading city. So there were wealthy cities in Devon and Cornwall, but there weren't really wealthy cities. There were wealthy cities in Devon and Somerset, but not really in Cornwall. And after the mining pact in Cornwall became quite an impoverished area, and nowadays Cornwall is kind of become the holiday coastal region of Britain, which is not always to the benefit of the natives, who are now sort of outnumbered by people from other parts of the country who moved there to retire or just have holiday homes and whatever.
Mm-hmm. And that's not so much the case in Devon. It's really Cornwall.
It's very much the case in Devon too, but Devon's much bigger. Devon's the second biggest county in the whole of Britain after Yorkshire. So there's a lot more room here. And actually, North Devon is the least populated region of the UK. Of England, sorry, not the UK. The Highlands is much less populated. Highlands of Scotland, but North Devon is the least populous area of England, which is nice. And also, it's the least diverse part of England as well. It's more than 99% indigenous.
Right.
So, but yeah, but
you're in the south part, aren't you? Are you in the north part? Or are you in the south part?
No, I'm in the northern part of Devon.
Oh, you are.
The southern part has the cities. There's no cities in the northern part of Devon. Both of the big cities of Devon are in the south, Exeter and Plymouth. And
right.
Yeah, they're more like Cornwall in the south, and it's more. There was a railway that was Victorian Railway. Brunel, the famous engineer, got this railway sort of going all the way through the south of Devon and into Cornwall.
Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Yeah,
most amazing name in the.
Yeah, he was a real remarkable man. But not everyone liked that way that the country was opened up. Anyway, now that railway system is it's not there anymore, but that people drive everywhere. But I suppose you're more interested in the ancient history of Cornwall. I suppose I should talk more about that than this modern stuff.
Well, or Devon as well. I like what you're saying. It totally reminds me of my relatives in Cornwall. Just because they would be. When you say it's like a insular place, or at least it was, I mean, more so, but even now, like if I talk to my uncle, he would even talk about a Devonshire man, like it's some kind of foreigner, and what's he doing here?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Wellcome Trust funded study, the People of the British Isles, they did a study and they found that, like, while, probably due to the mass upheavals of people during the Industrial Revolution, the majority of England is all one genetic sort of group, even up to, there's not even a distinction between the North and South, which are very culturally distinct. The North and South of England is the biggest cultural distinction in southern Britain. But there isn't a big genetic difference. But Devon is distinct from the rest of England, and Cornwall is distinct from Devon. And the boundary between Cornwall and Devon genetically is almost exactly the county boundary, which is the River Tamar. And that's an ancient sort of county boundary, which is really interesting. That should be preserved. But although this test was done only on people who said all four of their grandparents were born locally. So if you did a test in Cornwall of just random people, you wouldn't get that, because, as I said, Cornwall is now mainly populated by what they call incomers, which in distinction to Emmets. The Cornish call tourist Emmets, and then all the people who buy homes there and move in, they're called incomers.
Right.
Whereas in Devon they call the tourists grockles, and they both hate each other in a sort of half joking way, and they make, like, the traditional food of the West Country is the cream tea, which it doesn't mean tea with cream in it, as Americans might assume. It actually means a scone, a cup of tea and a scone. And a scone is essentially the same thing as what Americans call a biscuit, except that it's not served with gravy. It's served with jam and a very thick kind of cream.
Clotted cream,
only difference between Cornwall and Devon, the only difference between them is that one puts the cream on first and the other puts the jam on first. And this is such an important issue to them that they walk around with. They have it on their cars, bumper stickers that say cream first and stuff like that, or jam first. And they get really serious about it. It's a very funny rivalry between the two, but that obviously must go back quite a long way. I think that I wrote about this in my blog. The Devon was Celtic, of course. Domnonia was a Celtic kingdom, and it became somehow Devon in the Anglo-Saxon times. The Anglo-Saxons invaded in the east, and they were pagan at the time, and they moved gradually into the west. And the last part of England they got to was Devon. So by that time, the Anglo-Saxons were mostly Christian by the time they got here. So then some people make claims that Devon is therefore the most consistently Christian. Exeter's the most consistently Christian city in all of England, because it was populated by Christian Celts in the Roman times. And then they claim the Anglo-Saxons came and they were Christian by that time too. So there was no pagan intervention. So it's been a consistent Christian area. That's what the Christians like to claim. But I have demonstrated there were Celtic pagans in Devon at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, because the Welsh launched a mission into North Devon, at least. And then there were also some, before the Anglo-Saxons had properly settled in Devon, there had been military invasions of Anglo-Saxons and activities, including by pagan kings, Anglo-Saxon kings. So there were both Celtic and Anglo-Saxon pagans in Devon. So it's not true that there was a consistent, I mean, there might be a consistent population of Christians going right back to Roman times in Devon, but there were also pagans coming in, and the Vikings came here.
There was a period with Celtic and Saxon kings at the same time. Is that what you said?
Saxon pagans at the same time. It's possible. It's what I'm saying is it's possible. I can't be certain that there's no record of a Celtic pagan meeting an Anglo-Saxon pagan anywhere in England, because there were the Celtic at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, Celtic pagans were limited to some parts of the West. And by the time the Anglo-Saxons made it to the West, they were mostly Christian. So there's only a brief period when they could have been an Anglo-Saxon pagan and a Celtic pagan meeting, but it's possible it would have happened in Devon. And by that I exclude Gaelic pagans, because I think up in like the Northern Isles of Scotland, there were persistent Gaelic pagans for longer. Right. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about on the island of Great Britain itself, the main island. Exeter is a good record of this, because there was Anglo-Saxons come in, and there would have been like a dual culture society in early Devon, where there were two languages spoken, like the something ancestral to Cornish or similar to Cornish. It was before Cornish existed, because before Cornwall it was a separate place. And Anglo-Saxon were spoken side by side in the same city, and that must have gone on for about 200 years. Until an Anglo-Saxon king decided he didn't want his Celts there anymore, and he banished them all. And most of them probably just went into Cornwall. So a lot of the Cornish people are not the people who got pushed further and further out to the west of England, or their ancestors were. So they're to this day, Devon likes to take the title of "We were the first Christians," and Cornwall is where all the pagan hippies like to go. Is that true? Well, it's true. Those are both true things, but they're not. The Cornwall was Christian. It should be. Cornwall has an ancient Christian heritage too. The West Country, in its entirety, including Somerset, has this association with modern pagans, neo-pagans, a lot. Yeah. And that includes Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset. And one of the most important places of these is the town of Glastonbury in Somerset, which is, if you like esoteric, like literature, magical, occult stuff, neo-pagans, any of that, it's a great town to go to, because it's just covered in bookshops selling like Aleister Crowley this or whatever, like you can buy Guanon books, you can find all kinds of rare books on paganism and stuff. And that's because it's like pop, and all the pubs are called like the Wicked Wizard or whatever. Everything's like themed on this whole thing. And there's even this mad cult of a goddess. It's like this modern feminist cult that they made where they worship periods or something weird. But it's all made up, because there is no evidence of any ancient Celtic or Anglo-Saxon pagan cult site at Glastonbury. And I don't know why Glastonbury became like the capital of paganism, because it's got like it's what it is a really ancient site of Christianity, and it has evidence of very early Christianity in it, and for that reason it's really important in the Arthurian myths, I think. And I think it's the connection to Arthur that led to like the countercultural movement in the 1960s, and the hippies loving Glastonbury, and they therefore attached it to this like stuff that has literally no real attachment to. And similar thing happened in Devon and Cornwall, where people like attach it to like, there was ancient energy. There's special energies if you go onto the ground in Cornwall or something.
That kind of
make up stuff.
That's just that is modern hippie stuff. Yeah. So let me just ask you about King Arthur just before I lose it, because I wanted to ask you before, because I don't know what the current academic view is on exactly who or what he was. So he was a pagan. Was he even a king, like a pagan chieftain? And you even mentioned Tintagel there. I assume Tintagel was just the locals just made that up to say this is the seat of King Arthur. Is there some evidence that that actually was the case?
Well, I studied Arthurian literature in Middle English, but
Okay.
the idea that Arthur is a real person is not widely agreed upon. There are many who say he was, and many who say he wasn't, and those who say he was argue over who he was. So I'm not one of the people who's particularly interested in whether there really was a King Arthur.
Okay.
King Arthur was a really, really, really important, not literary figure, not just in England, but all across Western Europe, like Germany, France, everywhere. He was like the Star Wars of its day. It was like, or whatever, I don't know, whatever people like now. That's what he was like, really, really popular in all like, the king's courts. And France was like the capital of Europe in a way. France was really central, and their literature was actually more important for the development of Arthurian myth than probably the Welsh or the English was. So that's telling. And it's all got nothing. It's all impossible to be true. Most of the important Arthurian stories, it can't be true because he's like the king of Iceland before the Vikings. He's set in like the 5th century, and he's like meant to be king of Norway and Iceland or whatever. Like it's like the guy is set in the Dark Ages at the time the Saxons are invading, and he's supposed to be a Christian, not a pagan, a Christian Celt who was king. And of course, there's places in Scotland that say he was here, and places in tourism everywhere says King Arthur was here or there. But Tintagel really was a royal seat of Domnonia. Okay. So even though Arthur didn't exist, it really was a royal, a center like of Domnonia, the kingdom. Okay. So right. And Arthur, if he existed, was there. But what's important to remember is that we have Roman accounts of the Celtic heroes who like Boudicca or Caractacus who resisted Rome or whatever. And we have Welsh accounts of like the kinds of heroes who resisted the Saxons, like Vortigern or and the daughter Rowena, who these semi-mythical stories about Hengist and Horsa, and Hengist wanted to marry the Celtic chief's daughter Rowena and everything. So we have these, and then we have also like archaeological evidence of coins of like different Celtic leaders, and we have like inscriptions, like on Exmoor. I put in one of my films. There's an inscription of a Celtic inscription in Devon, or on a stone of a Celt living in Devon before the Celts were evicted from Devon, and he claims descent from Caractacus, and that's hundreds of years after Caractacus died. So Caractacus is a real hero who we know about. The Celts was talking about him hundreds of years after he died. The Romans were talking about him when he was alive. None of them mention Arthur. None of these people mention Arthur. He wasn't. If he was a real king, he wasn't a big deal. Like until much later, he became like a bigger deal, especially among the Welsh. It seems so. It does seem strange that he's being connected to Scotland or Cornwall, where if he was Welsh. But anyway, I don't know enough to say whether he was real or not. I've made a video where I talked about why I'm not really interested in whether he was real or not. What I'm interested in is he's like the archetype of a hero. And in the literature, Arthurian literature is nothing, even if he was real, Arthurian literature has got nothing to do with the real guy. It's to do with something completely different, which is like high medieval ideas of what the ideal king is supposed to be like, what the ideal court is supposed to be like, what the ideal knight is supposed to be like, and what the ideal society is and how people ought to be. And it's really interesting with all the mystical Grail stuff, like Julius Evola wrote about that in his Mystery of the Grail. That stuff's really interesting to me, but I'm not that interested in whether he was real.
Yeah, I did read Mort to Arthur. Did you ever read that? It's heavy going.
I studied that in Middle English.
Oh, you would have, yeah. But I just remember there was like incredibly harsh things he would do that he wouldn't don't make it into the modern versions of the tale. Like when he found out that his son was born of his sister. What was the son's name? The evil guy. Morgan.
Mordred, yeah.
Mordred.
His name means is related to the animal, and Martin, like pine martins and things. Yeah, I think his name derives from that animal.
Right.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, but I just remember he in the book his solution is to go out and kill all the firstborn kids in the land. He put them on a boat and sailed them out onto a lake so they starved to death or something. And that's King Arthur. The
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
well
but
as
that's
like
biblical as well. He is meant to be the ideal. He's a Christian, and the stories are Christian. So if it's a precedent of biblical stuff. Oh, that's the Egyptians, isn't it? So maybe it's not so great. But
is that based on Egyptian? I didn't even know that. Is there's an older story about that happening? Is there a king who did that?
well, it's in the Bible. The Pharaoh tries to
Oh,
kill.
killing the firstborns. Yeah, but I thought you meant
Yeah,
specifically putting them on a boat in the
No,
or whatever.
not that specifically.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. Some of the stuff in there. Some of the stories in Arthurian literature have parallels in stories in other parts of the world, which indicates that the stories are old and that they don't necessarily originate in Britain. Someone wrote a book claiming that a lot of the myths, and I've not read the book and I don't support it, but he notices the similarities between stories in the Nart sagas from the Caucasus, and therefore claims that the Scythian, they're Scythian in origin, and that Scythians brought them to the British Isles, but there's no evidence of that. So I don't go for that. But there are definitely mythic parallels in other parts of the world with the Arthurian things, and it could be just their perennial Indo-European myths. But the same thing is even in the later Robin Hood stories. You can see parallels in the Robin Hood stories from from late Middle Ages that are the same stories are in ancient Indian literature. Like the contest with the guy, the bow, the archery contest with the guy in disguise. That's like that's in the Indian myth as well.
Right. I didn't know that. I didn't.
Yeah,
That's amazing. Yeah.
So
That's
it's like
good.
Robin Hood will be real. I don't care. I'm more interested in myth than in that sense. What was the significance of the myth historically, rather than what was the historic significance of the myth?
Yeah, and it is fascinating, and fascinating how they all get mixed up and changed around, like the way that the old pagan sites get sort of Christianized, like it or not, and the way, like you say, Glastonbury, which was a sort of Christian site, becomes suddenly more pagan, neo-pagan.
Yeah.
How things switch around and get influence each other and then switch back again, which is normal cultural evolution, I guess. I think that always happened, but it is fascinating
that's true.
how it goes.
Yeah.
But your specialty really is do you specialize, would you say, in Anglo-Saxon paganism? Is that it?
Well, I mean, my in terms of my like formal qualifications, definitely, because that's the only area I studied. I studied like Germanic, like Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythology and stuff, and a bit of Arthurian literature at uni. But then since then, my studies have been more. I use that as a stepping off point to try and understand myths more generally in the Indo-European world. I couldn't say that I wasn't. I mean, I obviously know more about the Germanic myths than I do about Celtic or Indian, but I try to understand a bit about Celtic or Indian or Iranic or Roman and Greek, especially to help me understand Germanic, because I want to understand Germanic myths in the context of the more ancient Indo-European ones and how they're related.
Right, but you do so as a believer, right?
Yeah. So I'm a perennialist, so I believe in like the validity of the traditional religions, if you want to say that word, or the traditions or belief systems of other peoples as well. So not that like the Germanic religion is just the only one that happens to be correct, but they all have. They all are true in the sense that they reach towards the same thing. Basically what Celsus was writing in his The True Word, the True Philosophy, is not that different to what the traditionalists, perennialists came up with in the early 20th century. But I prefer the ancient view of it, the ancient Platonic view a bit, because it's not so focused on Islam. But I'm not against Islam, but I just think that they all are the traditionalists were a bit too heavy on Islam, too focused on Vedanta in the Indian tradition, and like too critical of Western, like very good Western scholarship on comparative Indo-European mythology. Like Guanon was like a bit of a retard when it comes to that. Really, he was saying that there's no such thing as the Aryans and that the Indo-Europeans never existed. and all this stuff, like basically because he couldn't understand it, and he was too focused on one way of seeing things, which was to accept the legitimacy of Vedanta as Indians now portray it, as Indian gurus and experts.
I wonder why that is. Was that an early kind of virtue signaling thing where he wanted to be? Why would they do that? Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I would call myself perennialist as well. But yeah, that's I didn't even think about that. How much? Yeah, they were more focused on the East than where they could have been in their own records of their own past.
Yeah, they're very anti. They claim to be anti-Orientalist because they say that the Orientalism was like a kind of Western misunderstanding of the East, and I can understand that. But then they also had like, and they were critical, and perhaps it was right. If I was writing in the 1920s, I might have thought the same way. Like Western scholarship was too empirical and didn't value the Eastern traditions on their own merits, and that was probably a valid thing for him to say. But in doing so, he himself devalued the empirical, the results that empirical study gets in academia, and things like comparative linguistics is undeniable. It's a proper way of understanding the way words change. It's a systematic process that is falsifiable and can be like, you can show the process and you can argue about it and improve it. That works at getting to understand how things actually occur. And the same with genetic science or whatever. So whatever you think about how materialistic the West has become, which is a valid argument that they made, you can't just do away with what's obviously a very effective and powerful and useful tool that the West have created, which is modern sciences and modern academia, and those things are all being under fire as well from the left anyway. But and maybe it was virtue signaling, but I don't think there was much to benefit for virtue signaling being at that stage when he was living as a French.
Well, I suppose the outside can always seem more exotic sometimes, or more, I don't know. Yeah, but who knows why? But yeah. So, but they wouldn't have had the some of the knowledge that you are able to get your hands on now regarding Indo-European and the language and the.
Well, a lot of the things I think about Indo-Europeans are just what all normal academics thought back in the 1920s. So Guanon was kind of like a rebel by saying, no, there was no such thing. Now, like all the, now it's changed around a bit. So, over the 20th century, even in the 1960s, I think a significant amount of historians and archaeologists would agree the Indo-Europeans existed and they expanded out of the steppe, and the Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain and Germanized the southern part of it. But these kind of invasion narratives, Anglo-Saxon, Indo-European, Aryan, they all became less popular over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, to the point where when I was at uni. When I was doing my master's in 2011, I was like really strongly told not to compare Anglo-Saxon horse burial techniques to Indian ones because there's no connection, and that whole Indo-European connection thing is just completely a bit far out there. It's a bit wacky. And then like 4 years later, Hark and colleagues released Massive Migration from the Steppe as a source for Indo-European languages. Which is a revolutionary paper that basically showed actually that happened. And, since then, there's been loads of what's called the genomic revolution. There's been like loads of genome-wide studies where they look at lots of genes from ancient skeletons, and they can prove things quite conclusively. And things like the Anglo-Saxon invasion definitely did happen. The Bell-Beaker invasion definitely did happen. The Aryan invasion definitely did happen. The Indo-European expansion from the steppes, or the Kurgan theory, definitely did happen. So these things all existed in Guanon's time as ideas, but there was arguably less evidence. Well, there was less evidence. And
what about the language? Did they have the language evidence that you have now?
Linguistics is the methods were all in place then. I think the main development, the only massive development in the study of Indo-European languages was laryngeal theory. And I can't remember when that was invented, but at first, laryngeal theory tried to explain some of the sound changes in Indo-European by saying like there was a laryngeal vowel sounds that none of the languages have now, which is why they diverged into all these different vowels. And then that was basically proven when they discovered Hittite. They discovered the Hittite language and deciphered its tablets. It was like written on Sumerian-style cuneiform clay tablets in Anatolia, but it wasn't Sumerian. And when they translated the language and understood it, they're like, "This is Indo-European." His word for water was basically water, and they're like, "This is the Hittites from the Bible." They figured it out that they were Indo-European, and they have laryngeals in their vowels. So that kind of really. I can't remember when that happened. I can Google it now, but
that's okay. It's all right.
Yeah,
there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of details to digest already, but yeah.
Yeah.
So the only people that we don't know so much about, I think, I mean, maybe we do more. I mean, this would be great to ask you, anyways. Is the people that were there, that the Indo-Aryans came in and got rid of the people who built Newgrange and Stonehenge and that. I mean, what's known about them, according to you, at least?
Okay, I wouldn't call the Indo-Europeans who came to Britain and Ireland Indo-Aryans personally. That phrase, I would use the term Indo-Aryan only to refer to the Indo-Europeans who invaded India.
Oh, right. Okay.
But they're very closely related to the ones who invaded Ireland and Britain. They're pretty much the same kind of race. But the ones who invaded Ireland and took over Newgrange. What did you ask me about them? Sorry.
Well, what is known about them? It's
they're Bell-Beaker. The Bell-Beaker people. The Bell-Beaker people pushed into Britain and Ireland over the course of 200 years. They sort of really replaced for most part, 90% of the population, and there are some exceptions. They've now published recently. It's a really interesting study I just shared today on my Telegram, that places like Orkney somehow was spared. So there was a big. The Orkney Islands had a very similar tomb culture to Newgrange. So similar, in fact, that it's thought that actually it was a copy of Newgrange. So like the tomb of Maes Ho on the Orkney Isles is probably like a cheap knockoff version of Newgrange. So the Boyne Valley has these big Neolithic tombs all along it, like Knowth, Owth, and Newgrange. And they were in communications with the people in Orkney. And when most of Ireland and Britain had been replaced by Bell-Beaker folk, Orkney preserved a Neolithic culture for longer, and they started taking Bell-Beaker women and breeding with the women, and so that the Orcadians preserved the male lineages of the original tomb builders, the megalith builders of the Orkneys, which is not what happened elsewhere.
So is that the only surviving? Is that the only surviving genetic strain of them then?
I didn't say they survived to this day. I just said it survived past the invasion of the Bell-Beaker for a few. It survived at least. I don't know how long they survived, but they survived for quite a while before they eventually integrated with the rest of Scotland. Just mixing with the rest of the Scotland. And Scotland is very Indo-European in blood, so it's not at all like the Neolithic inhabitants of Scotland. And then also Orkney got like 50% population replaced in the Viking era as well, because the Vikings basically took it over, and it even spoke. I think they even spoke Norse in Orkney for quite a long time. It was owned by the Norwegians until the Middle Ages. I don't think it was given to the King of Scotland until the Middle Ages. So a long time after the Viking era, it remained under Norwegian control. Anyway,
so let me just ask this, because I'm not even sure of this. So the people that they are trying to say now that are like dark skinned and blue eyed, like the what's his name, Cheddar Man, and all this, that the documentaries say, are they saying this of Bell-Beaker people or the people that they supplanted? I'm not even sure of this.
Neither. That's a third race that preceded the megalith builders. Cheddar Man is in Cheddar is in Somerset, by the way. Cheddar Gorge is in the West Country. That's another West Country thing. But Cheddar Man, his race of people called Western hunter-gatherers, they lived all over Britain, all over Ireland, all over Western Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, and most of Central Europe. But there was a different race of hunter-gatherers in Eastern Europe. Today, we have more DNA from the Eastern European hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic than the Western hunter-gatherers. But and the reason for that is because the a people from Anatolia came and brought agriculture into Europe at the start of the Neolithics, and they crossed. They spread from Southeast Europe, Greece, and then upwards, and then into Britain and Ireland.
It's like the golden age of Saturn.
Is that what it was? Well, so you're talking about 8,000 years ago it starts, and they have all this. They have this Neolithic era where Europe is mostly inhabited by these people of Anatolian descent, up until the Europeans come and just completely wipe a lot of them out, at least in the north of Europe. So the people who built the megaliths are the people of Anatolian descent. Mainly Anatolian descent, with a little bit of blood also from the Cheddar men who were there before, the primitive hunter-gatherers. Actually, the tomb of New Grange in Ireland you mentioned, when they did DNA tests on it, they found like he was different from the people he ruled over, the king, genetically. And he was related to another bloke from on all the other side of, I think in County Sligo, another tomb where his relative was in that tomb, and he was also they were different in respect. First, they were inbred, and secondly,
I read your article about this. I remember this.
Secondly, they also had the physical characteristics preserved from the hunter-gatherers who they replaced. So it seems like something weird happened where, like, the Cheddar men who all had blue eyes, had and swarthier skin than modern Europeans have. Somehow, like, they became an elite among the people who replaced them, or their physical characteristics were associated with the elites who replaced it. Because and we don't know why that is, because it's very strange.
It's incredibly fascinating, all of it. And so I've really picked your brain about that. That's stuff I personally wanted to know. We've gone off the topic of West Country a little bit, though. But when I asked you about your Anglo-Saxon speciality, I was wondering, you said because I don't know this either, that the Saxons, they stopped shy of going to Cornwall. Is that true when they invaded? Or
they never went to Cornwall, but I think that Anglo-Saxon DNA is probably in Cornwall to some extent, but not very much, and not directly from Anglo-Saxons. Like the way that the invasion happened, it seems like there was about 80% replacement, but in the east of England, only in the east of England, and then gradually everyone just mixed together, and that DNA sort of just diffused across into Scotland and into Cornwall. So the closer to the east of England that you are, the more ancestrally, the more Anglo-Saxon DNA you have. But the average today of English people is only around 40% Anglo-Saxon, and the rest is from the pre-Anglo-Saxon Britons. But the Cornwall being so far away had the least. And also had that special boundary that language creates, because they did preserve for a long time the Cornish language, but now it's not really spoken. It's not spoken natively at all. It's put on signs and things, public signs, but that's more of a cultural expression.
My uncle tries now and then. He's probably forgotten most of it, but he's very Mr. Cornwall. But actually, when I did my DNA test too, I was solid. I'm half Irish and half Cornish, and I solidly all the way back in history was this spot, like just south of Devon, North Cornwall. That's where I was from, whatever that the herd side of the family. And the name Arthur was in the lineage going way back to my grandfather's name was Kingsley Arthur Hurd, which is excellent, really.
That's a really base name.
Yeah. But so the Saxons they took over Devon. So when I first said this to you, I was going to ask you, so let's talk about the Pixies, and you said you don't think Pixies, or how you properly pronounce it, I'm not sure, is even a Celtic Cornish origin word. And you said some very interesting things, if you want to talk about that.
It's hard to know for sure. No one knows, basically. No one can tell you for sure that in Devon they say pisky, and I think in Cornwall they say pixie, so piskies or pixies. But it's kind of like it may well have been a word that was applied to something that of pagan origin that Celtic Christians believed in, like a little sprite. It was just because they convert to Christianity doesn't mean they stop believing in little sprites and what have you. But the no one actually can understand any Celtic word or root that it could come from, and it's not mentioned in any of the older pagan sources. So it does have a sim in Swedish, very far away, very un-Celtic. They have a word that's something like puski, which meant a kind of fairy. So it's very similar. So some people have said maybe that would be the origin, but there's no evident proof of that, except the two words sound the same and refer to a similar thing. There's like a similar puck as well has been proposed as a cognate. So in Ireland, that's mainly in Ireland, the word pucan. The pucan is
the ghost, yeah,
like a horse monster.
Yeah.
It's widely agreed that this pucan is cognate with what Shakespeare wrote about Puck, who is portrayed by Shakespeare as a very like sort of classical Greek pagan thing.
Is this a Midsummer Night's Dream or something, is it?
Yeah. So, but presumably it was influenced by indigenous English paganism of some kind. But the word puck is probably Anglo-Saxon in origin. So whatever the Irish probably applied it, the word, the Irish were occupied by English speakers. So they used English words to refer to their own things. So the pucan is probably an Irish Celtic thing of mythology, but the word pucan is not likely to be Irish. It's probably not, and it's quite possible pucan is related to pixie, so it might be an Anglo-Saxon word, but it's not in Anglo-Saxon either. So it's hard to say for sure. But the thing is, like, there are these great survivals of really pagan customs in the West Country, and people assume because the West Country is where Celtic language survived for longer than the rest of England, that these must be Celtic traditions. One such is but they're not. They're not Celtic traditions. They're definitely not. That's something like one of them is the maypole, tradition.
Okay.
And maypoles are here very, very widespread in Devon and Cornwall and Somerset. They survived, but maypoles they have maypole in Germany. It's called a Maybaum. It means maypole. It's literally a German. It's in Germany, and in Ireland they never had maypoles until the British introduced them, and instead the Irish had a May bush. So there was a similar Celtic tradition with a bush which they'd run around with, but it was so raucous, and they used to beat the shit out of each other with this bush and stuff. There's a lot of written about it in the. I learned a lot about it from Johnny Dillon's podcast. He had lots of interesting info about it. But the British introduced the maypole in an effort to sort of civilize the Irish, because they considered the May bush too raucous, whereas the maypole was a more calm and civilized thing. So that shows you that if it would, the pole is definitely not a Celtic thing. It was something that the English spread about. And so people in the West Country sometimes, because this is quite obviously pagan thing and it's in the Wicker Man, they skip around it and they want to call it Celtic, but it's not Celtic. It's Germanic. And the other one is wassailing, which has three different forms. Wassail can mean like a drink of hot cider. And all of West Country, by the way, is cider country. So the best cider in Europe generally come from this cider belt, which is the same latitude, like including the southwest of England. So that's Devon, Somerset, and Cornwall and Dorset, but also the northwest of France with Brittany, and then Normandy and Belgium. All these regions produce good cider. So the wassail is a hot cider drink, but it's also a song, which is like caroling, like a Christmas carol, but it's celebrated later in January, at the old date of Christmas, the pagan date of Yule, in fact. And the word wassail comes from the Anglo-Saxon was-thu-hal, which means good health, have good health. And the old Geoffrey of Monmouth, the medieval Welsh chronicler, wrote about the Anglo-Saxon invasion. He claims like that Hengist and Horsa, who are actually gods, introduced this term wassail to the Celts and taught them to say wassail when Rowena, the daughter of the Celtic chief, that they were drinking, and they said, in our culture you say wassail when you do this. So we know for sure it's an Anglo-Saxon thing. Now the other kind of wassailing thing besides caroling, which is like when you do it wassailing, you knock on the door and you sing and demand alcohol. But there's another more pagan version of it, which is done here in this part of the country I live in Devon, not in Cornwall. And then they go to the orchard around the 14th of January, 13th of January or something like that. And then they sing to the trees, the apple trees, and pour libations of cider on them and ask them to make more apples next summer so that they'll have more cider next winter. And they hang decorations on the trees, and they fire. Nowadays, it probably didn't happen originally. They fire guns into the air to scare away evil spirits that would harm the trees. And it's all obviously of pagan origin, like singing to and talking to trees. And
here around it's not in January, it's like the week after Christmas or something. I can't even remember now. I went to it once. Is they have the Ran of the Wren, and they sort of do something similar. And they sing. You're supposed to go around and sing outside someone's door until they bring you out some booze, and you go around singing door to door. So it's the same, I guess. And they dress in funny costumes. And
I mean that's pretty much all the customs of the British Isles. If you go back to their origin, and many other parts of Europe as well, if you go back to their earliest origin, it seems to always be just a gang of young men, often armed, knocking on people's door, demanding alcohol or food or women, and otherwise they're going to have threat of violence. And that's the origin of trick or treating. That's the origin of Christmas caroling. That's the origin. They used to have an Easter thing called a pace egging, which was the same thing. You go around demanding eggs or something. It's always just an excuse for mobs of young lads to go and intimidate people, really. And the Wren boys you described, they used to threaten to bury a wren, the smallest bird of the British Isles, bury a wren in the ground on the property if you didn't give them what they asked for, and that would curse the land. And that probably is Celtic, because the wren is a really important bird in Celtic myth. Like, it's the king of birds, they say. Because it outwitted an eagle in this myth. So
it's a beautiful, beautiful little bird.
Yeah, it's a lovely bird. It's illegal to do that. Hunting. The Irish used to hunt the wren on St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas. I don't think it's legal to do that because birds are protected species nowadays. A lot of them.
And when you were saying before about the piskies, and it's the similarity to the puka that reminds me of all that. Even here, the idea of the fairies is not. It's more modern. The idea that there's a cute little guy that gets you the gold or whatever. It's more that they were these ghostly remnant ancestral people, and in here especially, I don't know if it is over there so much. There was the doppelganger was a big thing, where they would replace you with somebody who wasn't you. And there's a lot of stories. I read it. I went to the folklore collection at UCD there, and I looked up some of them. It was absolutely amazing how much there was. And the stories of them, like, it wasn't just babies; it'd be adults as well. Someone could just get replaced. So it would just be and it was all the way you did it. I don't remember it now, like the way it would happen and what you would have to do was fascinating. I wish I could pull it out of hand in my brain, but I can't. But it was a big thing. The doppelganger was that as well in your Elsewhere?
No, the concern the Irish have with
changeling, I should say. Sorry, changeling, not double. Yeah,
changelings is very much an Irish thing. However, there is a Cornish fear of changelings as well, because I know that I did it actually. There's a ritual associated with a Neolithic monument in Cornwall called Menontoll, which is a Neolithic stone with a hole in it, and adults crawl through it as a cure for rheumatism and have done for a long time. But I made a whole documentary on this called Holy Holes. And I passed my son through it, but they used to pass children through it allegedly to make sure it wasn't a changeling, because apparently if it was a changeling, then it would be replaced with the real one if you passed the child through the hole head first. So I did that just to make sure, and also just in case any rheumatism afflicted. But the word fairy is adopted from French in the Middle Ages, and it comes to be used in the Celtic parts of Britain to refer to what they formerly called the Sidhe, which were originally sort of supernatural entities of various sorts.
Were they giants or something? Is this Sheehan? Isn't there? Is that the? Oh, okay, I recall that one, but yeah, go on. Sorry.
The Sidhe, is for example, banshee is just mean ban is in Gaelic woman, I think. So banshee means the woman she, and she originally means a barrow and burial mound. So it means like the people, the Sidhe are the people of the burial mounds in their original conception. So that means they're like spirits of the dead. basically the ancient dead, and that became gradually over time, like the word fairy was applied there, whereas in the Germanic parts of Britain, the word fairy was used to replace the word elf or elves, like which we had from English folklore. So
Elf was like, I thought elf was even the sort of a Viking origin word, is it not? Or am I wrong?
yeah, the word elf exists in both in Old English and and Old Norse. So alfar in Old Norse and ulfa in Old English. So it's common to all Germanic peoples. The elf law was in England, and then the Sidhe were in the Gaelic parts of the country, and then the term fairy in the Middle Ages was a blanket term for all of them. So when fairy law can sometimes refer to ancient Celtic stuff and sometimes refer to ancient Germanic stuff from the British Isles, but both of them, I think my own argument is that both the Sidhe and the elves they're respectively related to ancestor cults, and I've argued that in my videos at length, showing all the evidence of how elves can include in the Viking sources. They include some elves as ancestors, as they call someone who dies became an elf. So, and they also say that they connect elves to the dead and to barrows. So barrow is the British term for a burial man, by the way. So if they're connecting elves to barrows, and the Gaels are connecting the Sidhe to barrows, and then they both all get called fairies, you can see they're conflating them. And they were originally, as you say, like ancient spirits of the land who were probably the people who originally lived on the land. And then they, over time, get reinvented as these little people with little bug wings or something. I think that's a lot to do with the Victorian children's books.
I think so.
Yeah, which are quite lovely children's books in their own right, but they've kind of distorted what we think of an elf or a fairy actually is.
Yeah, I can tell you. I can't remember the details, but I can just tell you that the stories I read of the changeling accounts were actually harrowing, and it was like very deeply frightening.
Yeah. It's the same in England with elves. They were terrified of them, and elf bolts were things that would kill you, like invisible missiles that give you diseases, and your cow diseases. So your cow will not create milk. Your child will starve this winter. You will suddenly be struck down by an unknown disease. That's elves, and you've angered them somehow. And there's 10th century charms in Anglo-Saxon medicine books explaining how to heal yourself from the effects of elves. And Alfsiden means like to be under the influence of elves, to be sick from elves. So the fear in the British Isles of these ancestral spirits was very, very serious. These were like horrific. Now, whether they were originally horrific in pagan times, maybe they weren't so much. And it's like in Christianity, they survived, but they became more and more scary as they were.
It seemed like they could maybe go either way. Like they were very powerful, maybe mostly mischievous and malevolent, but then there was some good ones too. Like there's a lot of those accounts of the elf prince, which Shakespeare referred to as Oberon, which I always think of in my mind. Like when I'm in the woods, I think of Oberon, who was it Aberike? I don't know how to pronounce the other versions of his name. There's like Germanic and all different versions of the story of like an elf prince who lives in the woods. And he sort of helps. There's even Crusader stories of how he helps Crusaders, even though he's very pagan.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Yeah, but I mean, even in the pagan, the more like the sources set in pagan times, they say that you had to give sacrifices to the elves, just like the gods. And in the Anglo-Saxon sources, the gods are called Isa, and they're invoked together with the elves. So it's Isa och Elfa. So the gods and the elves together. So and they're not as high as the gods, but they're up there, and you definitely make sacrifices to them just like you do to gods. So I think, in my opinion, they're probably analogous to the Greek daimonos, something like the spirits that are in between the divine hierarchy between the mortal and the divine. So yeah, they're not evil, but they're definitely to be feared and revered. And after the sacrifices were sort of banned by the church, I think that these entities were just sort of seen as being demonic and fearful things that you couldn't appease, or that it was evil to appease, so you could only fear them. So yeah, there was also
another one Oh,
Odin.
sorry. Yeah, no. Go on. I don't want to. I didn't mean.
No,
to
that's okay. I was just saying there was also an explicit connection of elves to Odin, because when a Christian in, I think it's Austerfahrasvisr says, interrupts a sacrifice to elves, the sacrificer says to the Christian, "You can't come in here. We're doing a sacrifice to the elves, and we fear Odin's wrath." So for some reason, Odin was concerned that you make sacrifices to the elves.
Wow. It's also just excellent and amazing. I was going to say, just because you mentioned it when I brought up the pixies before, when I was just chatting with you on Telegram there, you mentioned something I didn't know about hobs, which is like a house where the word hobgoblin comes from, and you also brought up lares, the Roman version of not really fairies, I guess, but the dead, I guess. But you said they were all kind of related. So can you say something about that? Because that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Romans were in Britain for a few centuries, and was it like close to 400 years anyway. I can't remember the exact number, but they had this cult of the Lares, and the Roman Britons, even though they didn't leave a big genetic impact, the Romans didn't like change genetically the natives of Britain. That's been proven in a genetic study. They definitely did change the Britons culturally, and the Celtic Britons really adopted Roman baths, Roman lifestyles, and Roman customs like the Lares. So we don't know how. I mean, to some extent, the Celtic gods and traditions were integrated with Roman ones. So we can also consider to what extent that the Roman cult of the Lares was influential on like household god worship or household spirits or ancestral spirits in Britain. And the hob or hobgoblin is like that. It's a kind of an English belief in a sort of house spirit, but it's very friendly. No one's afraid of hobs in the old law. It's kind of like a Scottish brownie. In Scotland, they have this thing called a brownie, and it's like the English old hob. And they're also, both of them are much like in Sweden and Norway. They have Nissa or Tomte Nissa, and they are little folks who represent like the original inhabitants of the farmhouse or the thing, and they're appeased with bowls of porridge or something. You leave out a bowl of porridge for him, and he won't go wrong. He'll make sure that your shoes don't wear out and your cow keeps giving milk, that kind of thing. So it's sort of like you remember that other people lived in the house before you, and they might still be around, and that you give them a bit of food or something to appease them. So it's an ancient and almost perennial belief that seems to be in different cultures of Europe.
It's the very perennialist tradition, isn't it, really? Because that's the same one you find in Shinto and everywhere else, is the idea of leaving out a bit of food. And it was there right up so it's only been done away with in very, very recently. I guess Christianity and Islam and that stopped all that for everybody.
But even not always, because I was in Sumatra, an Islamic island, of course, and I found these customs surviving among the Batak people, and they have like belief in house spirits and ancestor spirits, and they leave food for them and stuff. And some of them are ostensibly Muslim, but I mean that it's not taken 100%. It's like Christianity came to the British Isles, but people carried on believing in fairies or whatever. First they called them they carried on calling them elves and the she, and then later they renamed them all fairies, and they carried on believing them and writing about them right into modern times. And in Sweden and Norway, they still give porridge to Nissa. Some of the old people still do that. I'm not talking about like neo-pagans. I mean like rustic types in the countryside. So it's really survived. Like they really think, I better leave some. I mean, Iceland, they're concerned apparently with where they build roads in case they build it over where the dwarves live. So
well, they did that here. They had to divert a road because it was an old fairy tree, a hawthorn.
Interesting.
Yeah, they did it somewhere a few years ago. And I know, I mean, I leave out a little something whenever I can as well. But there's even, I think I don't know, we can't know for sure how it works, but like the extent of your, I guess you're not a sacrifice, but your giving, maybe depending on what you're hoping for can be, and depending on how much you want the thing. I don't know if that has any relevance, but I just think of there's a golden boat thing quite amazing. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's like gold, and it was found in a lake here. And they surmise it was a Celtic king or something. This was his offering to the gods for something he wanted. It was just like a big hoard of gold, a big giant golden boat,
Oh
intricately
yeah, I
made.
saw that in the museum in Dublin. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
It's amazing. That little golden boat.
So he went out and threw it in the lake. Supposedly, that's what they say.
Yeah, water offerings are really interesting, and they're also they're definitely associated at first with the spread of the Celtic languages. So in Britain, the Beaker folk, who first came to Britain and Ireland, didn't make water offerings, but then during the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, they start doing that, and that is thought to be a sign that a new culture is coming in that does make water offerings. The Celts did make offerings to water, but the Germanic cultures also did. So Anglo-Saxon, but they came later. So I think Germanic cultures were influenced by Celtic continental culture. So that's why there's a lot of parallels also. But or they have they come from the same part of Europe, like Germany. A lot of the Celtic heartland is in Germany, and a lot of the Germanic heartland is in Germany. So there's going to be some cross influence there. But the offering to to bogs is older than that, but offering to like lakes and rivers specifically, that it seems to be something that comes around in the late Bronze Age and goes on through the Iron Age with Celtic and Germanic people. And it's very interesting because we have like some sources give us clues on what's going on. Like the Norse sources talk about like rivers of spears and rivers of weapons, and it does seem to be like the water itself is connected, seen as like because they envisage the underworld as a place full of rivers and water, a cold place. It seems that water is seen as like a liminal space that connects you to the world of the dead. So they might be giving to people in the other world by giving to the water in that sense. And it always makes me, whenever I see these like Germanic burial sword offerings, like the Thames Scrammer-Sacks, which I have a copy of here somewhere. Here we are. This thing. This was found in the Thames. It's a seax, an Anglo-Saxon seax with runes, Anglo-Saxon runes inscribed. They found it in London, so it was offered to the River Thames for some reason. But it reminds me of the Celtic heroes legends, Arthur and the Lady of the Lake, and the sword Excalibur coming out of the water. It just, I think that imagery of the sword in the water has some very ancient associations with the people in Britain.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, no, and I wonder like how much, if you're leaving something, if it matters. Like I often think it should be something that, like, as a practical, say, matter of practicing paganism, should it be something that you kind of want, that you're sort of sacrificing in a way, or just many people say just leave food, that as in they're hungry, and that's good. That's a sign of respect enough, and maybe it's both a bit. I don't know.
So you're saying that you give something that you want to
I
receive?
I feel like it's something. If I have some food that I really want, I will deny it myself, some little thing like some stupid treat or something, and leave it as an offering. And I feel like that's I don't know. That's just.
I think that I always tell people that when it comes to offerings in the context of a rite to a god, then it's all about value. So you have to offer something that has value. The reason they sacrifice cows and things is because those were valuable. So when you give up something of value, then you're making a sacrifice. But when it comes to like offering food to the dead, I think that like there's such a convention with porridge for some reason in several cultures, and the Slavs do that too. In their version of Halloween, they put porridge on graves and stuff. So I always think porridge is good. The Greeks and Romans had an association with beans. So the Orphic mystery cults, there was even prohibitions against eating beans because of this association with the dead. So they always gave beans as an offering to the dead, and also cakes sometimes. Cakes, they buried cakes, which is interesting because in one episode of The Sopranos, one of them has an episode when his wife dies and he buries a cake in her grave. And I thought, are they referencing the Roman pagan tradition of burying cakes?
Maybe. But it carries on. Yeah. No,
in my opinion, porridge is probably a suitable offering for the dead because that's what people seem to have always done.
Right.
But
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that's just something you never know. Like you're recreating something. I sort of follow my instincts, I guess, a lot of the time. But yeah, that's good to know.
If you know the person who's dead and you know they didn't like porridge, then maybe maybe it's not appropriate anymore. But if it's like a generalized offering to ancestor spirits, maybe it's all right. But yeah, I do think you're right about the principle of value. Like you want it, you're giving up something you value. That's important because that's the basis of sacrifice, and that's perennial too. Like the potlatch, or however you say it, the Native American cultures, where they just compete to smash up all their possessions, and whichever chief smashes up most of his possessions is the winner.
Yeah, I know.
Give away or
There's something to it, anyways. I don't know. That's what evolved into the Christian idea of sacrifice, but they don't really perform a material sacrifice. I don't know. I don't know what they do. They've changed everything around. So I wanted to say quickly about the edict we talked about, where the which one of the abbots or something. Where do I have it here? He was complaining about Devon and Cornwall being a hotspot of paganism and how they wanted to put an end to it. Where is it now? I have it here.
I think I got confused because you asked me about you mentioned a couple of edicts and two different things, and one of them I didn't recognize, and it referred to some French thing, I think, and the other was I did recognize, and it didn't refer to the West Country. It referred to England in general, and specifically it was aimed at that was Archbishop Wulfstan, and that was writing sometime between 1016 and 1035, and he wrote that you mustn't worship idols, and it will be
don't worship the sun and the moon or whatever. Yeah,
you don't worship the sun, the moon, fire, flood, wellspring, or stones. That definitely was. He was talking about not Celts. He was talking about Anglo-Danes. So
right.
That's like Anglo-Viking mixture people who were still, because even the Anglo-Saxons were pretty much all Christian by that stage. The Celts certainly were, but but some of the Anglo-Danes with like Viking ancestry were probably still practicing some kind of heathenry in the 1000s. So he was.
Yeah, no, I saw that. That's the one I was going to quote. I didn't catch on that it was for all of England. I thought it was still talking about Devon. So never mind.
It wasn't.
But I mean,
that's still specifically. But it might have been included. I don't think he was actually talking about Devon at all. Actually, I really think he was talking about the northern England people in the north of England, because that's where the Viking people were mostly.
Oh, right. So, like, was there a lot of Cornwall and Devon? Those are the two I always think of, anyways, more so. But they're notoriously pagan now, but they were fully Christianized, and even though they held on to a lot of folk ways and everything else, it's the same story as anywhere else. But what is your if you do have a theory? Do you have a theory of like why your own personal theory as to why Christianity was so thoroughly overtaking, apart from some of the
why Christianity was successful? You mean?
Well, yeah, why it was so all-encompassingly overtaking. I know there's a lot of.
Well, I don't like to have a theory for Christianity everywhere being successful, because it kind of like we have now the position or the privilege of looking back at history, and we can have this temptation to see it all as an inevitable. I mean, that's the pagan view, actually, that like fate makes everything happen a certain way. It has to happen that way. But like we have seen that completely different circumstances in different parts of Europe led to the success of Christianity. And often it doesn't have anything to do with the doctrine of Christianity itself. It's to do with leaders and powerful movers and shakers taking advantage of allegiances here and there. And there's so many different things going on. The initial success of Christianity in Rome was very interesting and had a lot to do with immigration, I think. Like not at the time of the rise of Christianity in the 3rd century and the 4th century, when it got really big. Over the 4th century is when it really became the main religion. But more earlier, because they've already shown now that the imperial Rome was basically like Middle Eastern. Like by that stage, there were so many Middle Easterners that the average Roman was much more Middle Eastern than the average Italian is now. So obviously Middle Eastern cults are going to be more popular when you import a bunch of Middle Easterners. But then as for the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages and the spread, particularly among the barbarians, that is, we Northerners, the Celts and the Germans and the Slavs and what have you, different things were happening. And I think it's more to do with elites trying to align themselves generally with more powerful states for trade and for other, reasons. And Christianity was the key to plugging into those social networks.
And also, was it to do with also, like, since it was all, it's places like here when it was all Latin and everything, and people didn't understand that it was so much different than what they were already doing, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, no one can understand it before. The idea of religion, if you've never heard of it, then it's very hard to understand. Like, they have actually records of, like, Anglo-Saxon. The Venerable Bede writes about how I can't remember which Anglo-Saxon king it was. I think it was a guy up in well, anyway, he was worshiping Jesus. He said, "I'm going to worship Jesus," and he got a statue of Jesus and he put it in the temple next to Odin and Thor, Woden and Thunor, which are the Anglo-Saxon versions of Odin and Thor. So he didn't stop worshiping the gods, basically, and you can see that kind of pattern everywhere where polytheism exists and Christianity is introduced. They're like, cool, right, another god. If you've proven to me he'll make me powerful, then I'll add him to the pantheon.
Right.
They didn't understand what was really being presented. And I think that Nietzsche had some good points when he was saying, I'm not a Nietzschean, but he had some good points when he was sort of arguing that the realization of the Christian ethos was actually only achieved in quite recent history, when people finally, like, almost as they were killing the Christian God, in fact, like, where it's like, this is a doctrine that completely removes you from your history. It completely upends everything and completely turns upside down the entire moral system of Europe, which was always about, like, the heathen morality. It's like, if you're beautiful, you're good. If you're strong, you're good. If you're rich, that's good too. Like, things that are good are evidently good and they don't need to be argued for. Like, it's clear. Like, if someone has happening to them, if someone's lucky, then he's good. He's lucky because the gods like him and they've given him good luck. If someone's got bad luck, probably something wrong with him, probably worth avoiding.
Which is kind of Buddhist as well, the karma and stuff. But but there was the whole paterfamilias thing, where the family and the honor in the family and the bloodline and all this was all that was reversed, and that was very, that was very real, genealogically real. That had a material foundation, let's say.
Yeah, he did say. I mean, they did say honor your mother and father in the Bible, but they also say, "I'll teach you to hate the world." And like,
you're right. You're right, though. It didn't really, and Nietzsche was right that it didn't really materialize into its final form until quite recently. And before that, it was not so. I mean, in the feudal age, and that, it really wasn't so. I mean, it's so different. You changed the name of the gods, but they were still like witches and dragons and everything, and they were still pretty like that. They were very much, like even the Arthurian legends and everything. And like, he's doing a lot of harsh things, and he's gaining power.
They're still like heroes charging around on horses. They're invading anyone they don't like and killing, slaughtering people and raping people and stuff. Like, the Bible tells them not to do it. So afterwards, they say their prayers and they ask for redemption. They go to the priest, tells them this many Hail Marys, and then you can go out and kill again. It didn't really take in the way it has now, even though
maybe religion then, it can be thought of like with Spengler's theory, like of civilizations, that when it reaches its sort of zenith, then it's kind of over. So if Christianity becomes fully realized, that's actually when it's also going to fade away or change into something else, which is sort of has or is.
That's interesting.
Yeah, maybe that's very perennial. No.
Yeah. I have to give that some consideration. I hadn't thought of it. Yeah, it's like could be true, but
because as like people of pagan mind, if we do believe in fate, then Christianity was inevitable, and that's fine. But maybe I think its time is fading or changing. Anyway, it's just to the new thing, whatever it's going to be, or new things probably. And yeah, that's what I would say about it anyways. But yeah, I think I've kept you for quite a while. We're at must be a good couple hours almost. I'm not sure, but I'll I don't know what else did we. Was there anything else we were going to say about the West Country we didn't get into? I mean, it's a beautiful place.
I think that it's really scenic and beautiful, and that's why people give it these mythic associations, and they want to connect it to paganism. It's because it's really like quite lovely. There's misty moors and beautiful beaches and cliffs and things. So it's a natural to associate it with these kind of these things, like something.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, the coastline is
Yeah.
the most wildest coastline, more so than the west of Ireland. The Cornwall and I imagine Devon
Quite
coastline.
similar to the Western Island cliffs, I think. I've never been to the Western Island, but I've seen the picture. It's like the same green, very, very green fields, very, very imposing cliffs, and then the big waves of the Atlantic. It's the same weather as well, rainy.
It's similar, but I honestly think some of the coastline I saw in Cornwall was even wilder, like just raging waves. Maybe it's just the time I was there. I don't know. And like some of the cliffs were just really
there can be some big waves. Lots of surfers there. There's a big surfer culture around here.
Yeah. You ever go or what?
I used to surf as a lad. My brother in Cornwall's a surfer still. I haven't surfed so much as an adult. I tried
your brother who's deep frying the pasties. Is that the one or?
Yeah, he's in the news. He's in the Cornish news. He's upset the Cornish because we have Scottish ancestry that compels us to deep fry things. And he decided to deep fry a pasty, and it made the news because Cornish people don't like people messing with their pasties, which is their national dish, I guess.
Oh, they wouldn't like that. No.
They didn't like it at all. But he may have started. It's called a pasty crunch.
Oh, I say it's delicious.
It probably is pretty good.
Yeah. He'll be a millionaire with it. If he did it anywhere but Cornwall, he'd be a millionaire.
He didn't patent it, so I don't think he can make any money on it. But,
okay. No, that's great. That's great. And yeah, Cornwall, Devon, I love it. I love that area. I can't wait to go back sometime. I will eventually.
Let me know when you're here. I'll show you around some of Devon.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I will for sure. I mean, in fact, I was going to meet you that time, and then right before the COVID, I had to cancel the whole holiday. And that's right when the COVID struck. That's the last time I made an attempt to go. But yeah, it has to be done soon. And it's a great part of the world to live in. You're very lucky. And yeah, I mean, you chose it. You knew what you were doing full well.
Yeah,
one of the better corners to be. But yeah, thanks very much, Thomas.
It's been great speaking to you. Cheers, Brendan.
Lovely to talk to you, and I'll talk to you again soon. See ya.
Ciao.